is that reality.
All right, good
is
afternoon,
not
Earth. This is
reality.
Adam Sturch broadcasting from the
There
Mushroom
may
Mansion House, New
be
Mexico.
no reality,
Working on oil
but certainly
painting,
this is not
conscientious
it.
emergence.
This is some
All right,
kind
picking
of
up from where I left
highly
off with the water
provisional,
patterning. Right now I've mixed up a very
culturally
variety of blues
sanctioned that we
and
are
some light
all
purples. I'm going to go within
participating in.
each
And
of
whatever it
the
is,
shapes and start adding a little
yields
detail.
ultimately to non-entity.
So let's
I
zoom
mean,
it
our
up.
realities are sustained by our being. And
Right there.
from looking at what happens to other people, we know that eventually you get laid into the cold, cold ground. And then what is your reality worth? So reality, whatever it is temporary and yields to non-existence. That seems to be the primary ground of being. Yeah, over here.
Well, just in putting out something that's a question to be explored as the week goes on, I mean, I've had that experience of, quote-unquote reality being this very subjective thing. My question is, even if it's not real, how could we use that fact to create a reality that's more enjoyable? And when it occurred to me was, you talked about these Amazonian tribes and how, what's happening on Wall Street is real there. Yet, at some point, that whole seemingly infinite forest could be cut out from under them because of what's happening on Wall Street. So I'm interested in how looking at this sense of reality not being real, how that all plays out with one reality intruding on another.
Well, I think that what it points us toward, and this is where modern philosophy in large measure has gone, is realizing that the primacy of language, that it's up until fairly recently, people have accepted the idea that you're born into the world and that's the world, and then you make the best of it. It's the hand you've been dealt. But what they didn't understand was that this is a card game where you never have to show your hand. So you can claim to be holding 8 aces. You can claim any damn thing you want. Reality is made out of language. Some people understand this and use it to bully the rest of us. I mean, we think, you have to show your cards, and they know that you just claim to have aces and 8s, and everybody gets out of your way. So, as a culture, what we have to do is, and I'm definitely not big on this whole French thing, but nevertheless, there is something to be said for this deconstructionist method. We have to get down to the bedrock of reality, which appears to be words, meanings, and ideas, and then build back up from that. We can, otherwise, what we get is the momentum of past error. We think of the people in the past as tremendously naive relative to ourselves, but it's their intellectual world that we're living in, because they thought up all this stuff. And then we are acting out the consequences of it. How can we take control of the reality-creating machinery and then direct it in a way we want to go? No culture on earth has ever done this, or even conceived of the idea, so far as I can tell. There's a lot of fun poked at feminism for its preference for words like chairperson and stuff like that. And these examples seem somewhat trivial. But in fact, the effort to reconstruct the language is very genuine, because thought can't go where the roads of language have not been built. So you decide where you want to go, and then you build a linguistic path there. This whole thing with the psychedelic experience, the way cultures lose touch with it is by not being able to say anything about it, And then it eventually gets so unsayable that if you start babbling about it, they throw a net over you. and say, oh, well, he became schizophrenic. They had serious delusions, had to be locked up, didn't understand that the universe is, a half sphere on the back of a turtle being carried by a dwarf, or whatever the sanctioned cultural reality is. So our political dilemma and our cultural dilemma is a linguistic dilemma. And we need to take hold of language and build it consciously. Now, so far, the only people who have understood this very thoroughly have been bad people, fascists, and other people with some hideous agenda that they wanted to displace the ordinary, haphazard way of doing cultural business with. But it is not intrinsically compromised. It's simply that the sly among us figured this out ahead of all the rest of us. But we can learn from them and can begin to sanction realities that never existed before. I mean, you've probably all heard me talk about memes and how the reason I teach, the reason I write, the reason we all get together is because we're trying to launch new memes. You all know what a meme is, right? A meme is the smallest unit. This is how I define it. Somebody told me recently, you define it wrong. It's all right. My definition is better. A meme is the smallest unit of an idea, in the same way that a gene is the smallest unit of organismic existence. So the meme of Marxism is made up of sub-memes of class struggle and return of the means of production to the workers and so forth and so on. These are Marxist memes.
So I don't understand why you're kind of getting under the point that it's language-based. Why can't this meme be visual?
Well, I define language so broadly that it can be visual. I mean, what it is it's the signifier for cognitive activity. And I don't want to get off into this kind of linguistic vocabulary about this stuff, but language means dance, sculpture, painting, poetry, song. It means cognitive activity. I mean, this is the glory of our species. This is what we do so much better than whoever's in second place. I mean, I guess the gorillas and the dolphins are a mile and a half behind doing whatever they're doing. But I just don't buy the notion that there is any other species on this planet, with the possible exception of mushrooms, that is involved in this language-making enterprise in quite the way we are. And it's how we escaped the iron constraints of organic existence. Culture is a kind of environment that we have learned how to interpose between ourselves and whatever is really out there. And we don't know what it was because we invented culture 50,000 years ago and nobody's seen anything else since. But there was something there that was so frightening and so alarming to us that we invented culture as a membrane that we would place between ourselves and it. And then there have been other membranes invented since. Urbanization. Let's all crowd into cities and jabber to each other. That will hold it even more at bay. And so forth and so on. I mean, we really behave as though we fear something tremendously toxic or something which has a dissolving force over our being that lies beyond the frontier of language. And this relates to the ego. The ego is this cultural invention that we have created. People don't need egos. I mean, you need one in this culture because everybody else has one. And so you have to use yours to navigate through it. But it's not a necessary concomitant to being human. we could operate without them. But somehow we became traumatized by the experience of raw, unlanguaged nature, and we created this strategy. And it's no different than, some creatures create nests underground, and some creatures coat themselves in toxic slime. We also did that, by the way, because there's something that has to be held back and suppressed that's very alarming.
It seems to me that you're, on one point you're saying that, we're way ahead of the dolphins because we've created this linguistic-based, thing. And on the other hand, I see it as, you've also just said that we've created this linguistic-based hallucination that's isolated us from a perceptual-based, I hesitate to use the word reality, but whatever you want to call it. And so why is this culture an improvement?
Well, I'm not saying it's an improvement. It's an experiment of some sort. No other creature ever took this particular tack. Now, evolution seems to have its own set of values. What evolution is seeking to maximize is expression of the individual genome. In other words, there are two ways that a species can be successful. It can either evolve into an unoccupied niche of some sort that it then can tenaciously take hold of, or it evolves strategies for generalizing its existence so that it can occupy all sorts of niches. And this is what we've done. And when you look at the two possibilities, you see that creatures which follow the maximize adaptation to a single niche strategy usually become blocked. Cockroaches are a good example. Evolutionarily, we could say that they are tremendously successful, but all they do is persist. They haven't modified or changed themselves in 150 million years.
On your definition, if there's more cockroach genes out there than human genes, they're more successful than us.
Well, not my definition, but the definition of biology, and cockroaches are always held up as this tremendously successful evolutionary adaptation. We have set out on a different course, and it's a course of continual redefinition. We can retool our culture very quickly. We have thrown away the mechanisms of genetic change and natural selection through modification of mutation, which was very, very slow and apparently a random walk. It didn't have any kind of telos. But cultures can actually set up goals and move toward them. Even very large and unlikely goals. Like the Third Reich, their decision that it would be a good idea to eliminate Jews from Central Europe. This is a crazy idea. It would never happen. Nothing like that would ever happen in a situation of organic evolution. But in a situation of cultural evolution, the idea becomes the guiding image for the society, and then outrageous things are done, and the consequences of that are played out. I would like to think that that we have not escaped from the yoke, the controlling yoke of nature. In other words, we aren't off on some demonic tear where we are just like evil incarnate, but that actually nature requires a species such as ourselves to basically to harness energy. We are on a higher level doing what the mitochondria did in the abiotic oceans of the earth 1 billion years ago. We're energy storage and release mechanisms sanctioned by nature for some purpose, which will be visible somewhere downstream in the flow of time, but which is opaque to us. For us, history seems a kind of a nightmare. But it must, I think, have a happy ending, or it would never have been allowed to happen in the first place. I just don't think that a monkey species had the wherewithal to evade the mechanisms of control and constraint that guide and direct everything on the planet. There is a purpose to history, and I don't want to go into it tonight, but as many of you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, trying to figure out something good about the human race, something that can be said of us that will redeem the sins that we have visited upon the planet. And it isn't easy, but some of our best people are working on it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
If in fact part of what we are is the unveilment of the world or nature, as you're referring to now.
Well, maybe what's going on is that nature, you see, we as individuals can remember the past and model the future, but it may be that nature operates in an entirely different way. This harks back to our discussion of Platonism. Nature may have a kind of viewpoint in eternity. Nature may actually see what needs to be done and can plan on a scale of 1 million or 100 million years. So that, well, this is slightly afield, but it keeps coming up, so it's worth talking about. Every body in the solar system, all of the inner planets, all of their moons, all of the solid bodies that orbit around the gas giants in the outer solar system, every piece of rock in the entire solar system has just been hammered to pieces by asteroid and planetesimal infall. And we prefer not to think about this. As recently as last January, what's called an Apollo asteroid crossed within a half lunar distance of the Earth. This is hair-raisingly close. And there's this crater out in Arizona. It's only 50,000 years old. Whatever came down there was only about 30 feet across. And everything within 800 miles died instantly when that thing came down. There's a scar on the Canadian shield larger than the crater Copernicus on the moon. Now this crater is over 1.5 billion years old. The point being, the universe may be a fantastically chaotic and dangerous place. And so our cheerful model of what biology is about is that, we've evolved over 1.5 billion years, and we have 1 billion years more, and there's no hurry, and it's all fine, and man has thousands of years to work out the problems of civilization and so forth and so on. But it may actually be that nature senses some kind of danger, and that a species like ourselves is a response to this danger. Our most astonishing feat as a species to date, besides language, I think, is that we can, though we are made of mush, we can summon to the deserts of this planet the light which burns at the center of the stars themselves. Not bad for anthropoid apes. I mean, granted, as soon as we do this, we then plot and scheme on how to bring it down on the heads of our enemies. That's not our noblest trait. But the fact that we could go into matter and wrest a secret like atomic fusion from it, and then carry that out, is astonishing. And it may be that history, which lasts in the technical phase 25,000 years, something like that. I mean, if you go back just 15,000 years, it's a pretty bare wire scene. So the whole thing is a wink of an eye, a geological instant from somebody getting the idea that you could flake flint off a core to the idea that you could send a starship to Zeta Reticuli, 25,000 years to do that. And so I think that we have a destiny, and probably our destiny is to save the planet. And, it would be the final irony if we spent a huge amount of time hammering on each other to get rid of nuclear weapons and stop cutting the rainforests and stuff like that. And then one of these planetesimals contacted the Earth and we all died instantly. This thing that passed by at a half-lunar distance in January, it was not detected until 5 days later. Had it actually impacted the Earth, you would never have known what hit you. This thing which killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, it raised a tidal wave 5 miles high that moved out from the impact point at 5 times the speed of sound. Can you picture a tidal wave 5 miles high moving at Mach 5? I mean, we're talking major smush here. And
A good girl.
yeah, right. And the evidence is there that this happens, that these things are not rare, that it will happen again. I mean, if you take a long enough time span, they say it's a certainty. Take it to the bank.
But still, the Earth survives. So when you say, do you
Well,
know
it survived. This thing which killed the dinosaurs, nothing larger than a chicken walked away from it. On this planet, nothing larger than a chicken. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news is the flowering plants evolved in the wake of that catastrophe. The mammals got their purchase. They were egg-stealing weasels up till that point. And then this opened up an opportunity for them to rush in and exfoliate all kinds of different forms. The Earth has faced outrageous crises in its history. At a very distant point in the history of the Earth, anaerobic life dominated the Earth. And then it began to produce oxygen as a toxic byproduct. Oxygen was
Alright, that's going to take a few more minutes to do, so I'm going to cut this now and pick it up with it.
These were
Take two.
evolved, and this huge problem was gone around, and we then are the result of this. So yes, there is finally no moral judgment. There's just, shit happens. That seems to be the rule, and then you can think it's good or bad or indifferent. But that's not the human point of view. The human point of view is that we have something very precious here that we want to conserve, that we want to carry through any conceivable catastrophe. And so, technology may be a strategy for this. This is why it's very important for us to think about reality on different levels. I started out by talking about philosophical reality, something for, elderly people to discuss in bookline parlors. But there's also stuff like, what is the reality of our circumstance in this star swarm, in this galaxy? Are we safe or are we imperiled? What should we be doing? Is it okay should we be worrying about saving the rainforests, or is that preposterous in the light of what we're facing? And how can we know? What is to be done? The Tolstoyan question. What is to be done? You can't begin to answer that question until you have some notion of what reality is. And at this stage, in trying to understand what reality is, all processes seem to me to be deconstructive. We need to take apart our languages, our cultural assumptions, the geological history of this planet, the biological history, the astrophysical nature of the structures in which we're embedded in. We need to awaken to our true circumstance. The dreams that culture gives us, that we should be good Nazis or good Buddhists or good Witoto, or these are just illusions that are temporary delusions which make possible the business of culture. But something now is happening that is different. We are becoming a global civilization. Power is being given into our hands that is truly power on a cosmic scale. I mean, what difference did it make when bronze-tipped spears were the heaviest thing anybody could bring to bear on any problem? But once you can blow the earth apart, like putting a stick of dynamite in a rotten apple, then you actually become actors on a cosmic scale. And this is the situation in which we find ourselves. This is why there's a certain urgency, I think, because I totally disagree with people who think that human history, can be seen wandering aimlessly into the millennia of the future with faster spacecraft and better packaged foods and more effective forms of psychotherapy and so forth. I mean, this seems to me preposterous. Obviously, human history is some kind of self-limiting process that is seeking to maximize something, and if you look over what we've been doing, it seems like what we're trying to maximize is an ability to release energy. Well, there may be more exotic ways to release energy than thermonuclear fusion, but thermonuclear fusion is a huge leap in the order of magnitude of the kind of energy that you can release. I mean, before nuclear fusion, the biggest explosion, the biggest release of energy that anybody could create was some kind of conventional bomb of some sort, which didn't amount to zip except in the place where it happened to be dropped. Nuclear weapons are a whole other thing. I mean, all our dreams, all our religious fantasies about the end of the world, that was harmless enough stuff when all we could do is split each other's heads open. Well, okay, so that's perhaps enough about the point of view of straight science, because I doubt there are very many people in this room who actually practice that kind of science. A point that should be made about reality that comes slightly closer to the experience of each of us is, for society to work, for reality, always in quotes, to work, we have to assume that we are sharing the same reality. And there are different levels on which this assumption operates. For instance, many of you have heard me talk about the slippery vicissitudes of language, that in fact we are communicating, we are most in agreement when we are silent with each other, because then our assumptions about how we're in agreement are able to fully unfurl themselves. But all it takes is somebody breaking that silence and stating the contents of their mind for the assumption of our shared reality to completely collapse upon us. Because it turns out, I think it's one way, you think it's another, I believe we're doing X, you think we're doing Y, I think we're serving so-and-so, and you think we're serving somebody else. And this is why, I think great relationships are built in silence, because then nobody ever finds out what's really going on. Did you want to say something?
When you're talking about science, you're talking about science, the kind of science where in order for it to be science, you have to repeat, in a certain situation has to be repeated, and you have to get the same response so that proves out to be a truth.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good definition of science.
So that when you're talking about reality in the moment, that never proves out true, because if you're in that artistic moment, then you never get a repetition. You're getting a synchronicity where your reality is in tune with a flow that the words I use is like miraculous. People start showing up when I need them to the chop chop, and it's when I let go of my ego and my need for a specific thing that flow starts to happen. And in a scientific world, you need the same thing repeated several times in order to get it to be the truth.
That's right. I mean, a good definition of science, not one that any scientist would be comfortable with. I mean, they think they're doing God's work or something. But the fact of the matter is, what science is the study of those phenomena so crude that a return to initial conditions will cause the phenomenon to repeat itself. Well, if you think about your own life, there's nothing like that in your own life. Love affairs, careers, disappointments, nothing that we experience as human beings has that quality. So science, this is the problem with science, is that in the pursuit of explanation, it has cut itself off absolutely from making sense of anything in our own lives. That's why in efforts by science to move into the domains of our own lives have not been happy. Sciences like psychology and sociology are pseudosciences as far as I'm concerned, because the objects they seek to explicate, personalities in one case and human group interaction in another, are not scientific phenomena, because they don't fall under the rubric of restoration of initial conditions allows the same situation to unfold. But I want to point out, go further than this. Well, first of all, let me say one more thing about that.
Anyway, you just said it's not quite true, because if you were able to provide the whole set of same initial conditions, which is impossible to provide, but if you are able to provide exactly the same circumstances, there is a chance that may happen. The problem is that you are not able to understand what all the initial conditions are.
No, I think that since the invention of the probability calculus, that's not even believed anymore. In other words, the idea used to be that if you think of the universal history as a film, that if you ran it back to the beginning and then hit the start button again, everything will happen exactly like it happened before, and I will be born in poor but humble circumstances in a Colorado mining town, and it will. But I think now the understanding is that only generally would the same things happen, and that even in orthodox science, probability allows for slight deviation from, so it isn't an absolute determinism.
Well, I don't believe that, because my feeling is that what we are just saying is that we don't understand what's happening, and the probability is just saying, more or less, I guess it's going to be around there. I just have some idea of what's happening, but it's saying, I'm not understanding the process really well, and therefore I can guide you across where you're going.
So do you think that if we could return to the initial conditions of the Big Bang and have it happen again, that 5 billion years later, I would be sitting here with the same amount of change in my pocket as I have right now?
I don't believe that we could do that.
Well, you brought it up.
We could go back to the Big Bang and be back there. But what I'm saying is that the fact that you're saying that if you go back to the same initial conditions, then it's going to repeat itself, that statement is not true. It's not true either.
Well, see, the problem is there's only one set of initial conditions that are truly initial, which is the Big Bang. All other sets of initial conditions are embedded in some larger surround where everything has changed. I mean, for instance, if we say, well, we can never restore initial conditions. The planets have moved. The stars are older. How can we restore the initial conditions? Everything only happens once, and then it's changed. It never repeats itself. But I'm plowing toward this thing. But I want to say one more thing. I'll subvert myself. That is, in order to do its work, science had to, and this happened with Descartes, it had to take the things that are most dear to us, colors, taste, feeling, tactility, and it defined those things as what it calls secondary qualities. Basically, this is a way of saying they're not important. None of that is important. And what is important are primary qualities: spin, velocity, angular momentum, charge. Strangely enough, things none of us have a very intuitive grasp of, nor do we ever encounter these things in any naked form. They're always embedded in matter. So science, in order to do its work, basically had to define the universe of feeling, emotionality, and immediacy as somehow peripheral, derivative, epiphenomenal, unimportant. And we all live with this legacy, unconsciously or consciously. You know, we are the victims of this kind of denigration of what we intuitively feel to be important, which is immediate experience. And immediate experience is not an object for scientific inquiry. Never has been, never will be. I mean, these pseudosciences fiddle with it a little bit, but the first thing they do when they study, for instance, human behavior, is they don't study, they set up an experimental situation, which is not like any human behavior you've ever dealt with before, like either, looking at screens and pushing buttons or receiving electric shocks if you get right answers and stuff like that. I mean, how many times do we find ourselves in a situation where if we get a right answer, we avoid an electric shock? I mean, it's absurd. However, then, there is a further distancing from reality that takes place that is not to be laid at the feet of science, although to discuss it we have to use scientific terminology. And that is, it goes like this. We all assume that if we are, I just stated what a great thing silence was for building shared assumptions. So if we are all silent and we look around us in this room, we do tend to make the assumption that we all see the same thing, that we are all sharing the experience of the room. But when you analyze perception, you discover a very weird thing about perception. For instance, let's take the primary sense in human beings, which is sight. We trust our eyes. We believe that that our eyes tell us something about immediate reality. However, if you analyze what sight is, what seeing is, it's that light reflected off surfaces pours into a sensory organ and then is transduced through a series of neurological transforms into an interiorized model of the immediate surround. The problem with this is that the light which enters my eyes is entirely mine. You don't get any of it. And the light which enters your eyes is entirely yours. Not a single photon is ever shared by two people. If it's my photon, it can't be yours, because photons can only be in a very discretely defined area of space, in this case in my retina. So everything I'm seeing is entirely opaque to you, hidden, occult, and everything you're seeing is entirely opaque and hidden to me. We are truly prisoners of our unique perception. So it's a miracle that we can build models where we get any sort of shared consensus out of it at all.
Sir, may I say something?
Sure. You're driving the tape editor mad.
You can turn this around, because the twin photon experiment shows, in fact, that there's no way that a photon can be considered as an individual object. I mean, what the experiment demonstrates is that every photon fills the entire universe.
Well, it demonstrates it by the fiat of a fishy formula, don't you think?
No, I think it's
Well, why not?
How do you explain the interference pattern?
Well, I think that explaining it, it's not really explainable in the sense of if you mean how do you reduce it to a linear logic, you don't. It's pretty mysterious.
Yeah, well, it does come out of a linear. I mean, it ends up you have to assume that the photon goes through both slits, and you get the interference pattern as a linear superposition of the, so it is in a sense linear. But what I would argue is, since a photon is not a little particle, it's something else. I mean, at least one of its properties is that it fills the entire universe and can interfere. One could understand that we're all receiving, in fact, the same photon. Every photon that goes in my eye goes in everybody else's.
Well, but when you say it fills the entire universe, it fills some parts of the universe much more than others.
Yeah, that's the probability.
Yes, and that's what gives it its particulate nature, is that it tends, it is technically everywhere, but it's only technically everywhere. In any practical sense, whenever we carry out a measurement on it, and seeing is a kind of collapse of this quantum vector, then it appears to be particulate.
That's absolutely right. We've only ever observed photons as particular, but the effects we observe, like the interference pattern, is not particular. You can't explain it.
That's right.
So even though that photon that goes through your eyes mostly goes through yours, and only a little bit goes through mine, you can't ignore the bit that goes through mine, because there are lots and lots of examples of quantum.
But don't you think that the experiments which prove this kind of thing are depend on such a vast chain of assumptions that the experiment itself becomes highly questionable? I mean, first of all, the first assumption that's made that is absolutely outside the realm of proof is that mathematics has something to say about reality. And we could actually have spent the entire evening on this, except that it probably would clear the room of all the most hardcore. But no one has ever shown why operations with numbers, which are after all entities only met with in the confines of the minds of anthropoid apes, should somehow have this overwhelming relationship to reality. What is the relationship of mathematics to what we call reality? The fact is, nobody knows. It's a deep mystery. Well, then when you talk about experiments, the assumptions, the hidden assumptions behind any experimentalist approach are usually so great that once made explicit, the experimental method is
Alright, well that gets each of those shapes glazed and colored in a unique way. I may end up detailing them a bit more. I'll stare at that for a while because I'm liking that, but next will be the cloud detail on the left side. But for the moment, I think that's it. So that's it. Let me get my tripod loosened up here. There we go. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting conscientious emergence. Thanks for watching and have a good day, Earth.